The sound of her hand hitting my face echoed across the entire office floor like a gunshot. Then came the second slap, harder than the first, snapping my head to the side. My cheek burned like someone had pressed a hot iron against my skin, and my ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. Marlene, my manager, stood over me with her chest heaving, her face twisted in pure rage. Her eyes were wild, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles bulging. Around us, the open-plan office had gone completely silent. Diego froze at his desk in the next pod over, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth. Kira stopped mid-step by the printer, her mouth hanging open in shock. Even the new intern dropped his stapler, and it clattered loudly against the tile floor, breaking the terrible silence. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Nobody came to help me. I stared at my own reflection in the black screen of my monitor, my face pale and shocked, a red handprint already forming across my left cheek. If I say anything right now, she'll fire me on the spot. My throat tightened as Marlene grabbed a fistful of my shirt collar and yanked me forward so hard I nearly fell out of my chair. Her voice was low and venomous as she hissed into my ear, her breath hot against my skin. Conference room, now. She dragged me across the office like I was a disobedient child being hauled to the principal's office. Her grip on my collar was so tight that I could barely breathe, and I stumbled trying to keep up with her angry stride. The small glass conference room was tucked in the corner of the floor, visible from almost every desk in the building. Marlene shoved me inside with both hands, and I crashed against the edge of the table, my hips slamming painfully into the corner. She stepped in behind me and slammed the door so hard that the thin walls shook and the framed motivational poster rattled. The blinds were halfway open, which meant everyone outside could see us but couldn't quite hear what was happening. I knew she liked it that way. Public humiliation without actual witnesses who could testify to her exact words. She started pacing back and forth like a caged animal, her heels clicking sharply against the floor with each aggressive step. "Girls like you can't handle any pressure," she spat, waving her arms dramatically in the air. "You're dead weight around here. I don't know why I even bother keeping you on my team." I sat frozen in my chair, my hands gripping the armrests, trying desperately not to cry because I knew the security cameras mounted in the ceiling were recording this entire encounter. My bag sat on the floor beside me, partially unzipped, and I could see my phone screen peeking out from the open pocket. My hands slowly reached down toward it, trying not to draw her attention. My thumb hovered over the record button for just a second, my heart pounding in my chest, before I pressed it with a shaking finger. I set the phone face down on the table as quietly as I could, praying desperately that the microphone would pick up everything she was saying. Marlene leaned over me, planting both hands on the table, her face inches from mine, and launched into a vicious tirade about how I was lucky to even have a desk here, and how she could make one phone call and end my entire career in this industry forever. Her words came out in a torrent of rage and contempt. Every fiber of my being wanted to scream back at her, to defend myself, to explain that she had dumped this entire project on me at 11 o'clock last night with absolutely zero instructions or context. But I bit down hard on my tongue until I tasted blood and stayed completely silent. I let her dig herself deeper and deeper. Through the glass walls, I could see shadows gathering in the hallway, other employees pretending to walk by on their way to the break room, but really stopping to watch what was happening. Their faces were pressed close to the glass, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Then Marlene's voice rose even louder, loud enough that I knew the entire floor could hear her clearly now. "If I have to hurt you to make a point, I will," she shouted, slamming her hand down on the table so hard that my phone jumped slightly. 12 hours earlier, I had been sitting at my kitchen table, hunched over my laptop with burning, gritty eyes and a cold cup of coffee beside me that I'd forgotten to drink. It was past midnight, and the apartment was completely silent except for the clicking of my keyboard. I was juggling 3 separate deadlines that were all crashing down at the same time, trying to prioritize which fire to put out first. Then my email notification pinged loudly in the quiet room, making me jump. It was from Marlene, sent at exactly 8:47 in the evening, long after normal business hours. The subject line read in all caps, "Urgent. Client deck due tomorrow a.m." I opened it with a sense of dread already pooling in my stomach like ice water. She had just assigned me an entire week's worth of complex analytics work and expected it finished and polished by 9 the next morning. No context about what the client wanted. No guidance on format or approach. No offer to help or provide resources. I scrolled back through her previous messages from the past few months and saw the pattern I had been trying desperately to ignore. Last-minute project dumps with impossibly vague instructions, followed by brutal public blame when things inevitably went wrong. My roommate texted me asking if I was still coming to her birthday drinks downtown at the bar on 5th Street. I lied and said I was almost done with work. The clock on my laptop screen read 2:13 in the morning when I finally whispered to myself, my voice cracking with exhaustion, "I'm going to pay for this tomorrow." I thought back to my first few months at this company during what they cheerfully called my trial by fire period. Except the fire never stopped burning, and nobody ever threw me a rope. There were so many small moments I had ignored or tried to brush off as normal workplace stress. Marlene taking full credit for my ideas in executive meetings while I sat there silently fuming. Her making jokes in front of clients about how I cried too easily and couldn't handle criticism. The casual warning she gave me during my 3-month review not to make waves if I wanted to stay past my probation period. I had gone to HR once, just once, to tentatively mention that I felt uncomfortable with how she spoke to me and treated me in front of others. The HR representative, a middle-aged woman with a tight smile, had nodded politely and said, "Marlene just has a very strong leadership style. You'll get used to it once you've been here longer." I watched Marlene cycle through 3 different assistants in just 6 months, and each time someone quit, I told myself I just needed to toughen up and grow thicker skin. But there was one specific moment I kept replaying over and over in my mind, like a nightmare I couldn't escape. Last month, when she leaned over my desk during a particularly stressful afternoon and whispered so only I could hear, her voice cold and threatening, "Remember, you're replaceable. There are 100 people who would kill for your job." It didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt like a promise. Back in the conference room, I glanced up through the glass and caught Diego's eyes. They were wide and guilty, filled with the shame of someone who knows they should help but won't risk their own job. He quickly looked away. Marlene was still pacing, her voice climbing higher and higher as she called me lazy, incompetent, and said she might need to make an example out of me so the rest of the team would stay in line. My hands were shaking under the table, but my phone was still recording every single venomous word. A notification popped up silently on my smartwatch. It was a Slack message from Kira that simply read, "We all saw. Cameras did too." My heart slammed against my ribs as I glanced up at the small black camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. I had forgotten it was there. Marlene was so focused on tearing me apart that she hadn't even noticed it. The realization hit me like cold water. Everything she was doing was being captured. I realized in that moment that if I wanted this to actually mean something, I had to let her keep talking. I had to let her bury herself completely. So I forced myself to ask a question in a small, shaky voice that sounded terrified. "What did you want me to do differently?" It was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. She exploded. She admitted that she had dumped the project on me with no notice. She said, "People like you should be grateful to even tolerate abuse if it meant keeping a paycheck." She bragged that she was untouchable because she had been at the company for 10 years and had dirt on everyone who matters. My stomach twisted into knots, but my brain was taking mental screenshots of every single phrase she used. She leaned in close again, her breath hot on my face, and snarled, "HR works for me, not you. Don't ever forget that." I nodded like I believed her, even though my heart was racing with something that felt almost like hope. Across the office, Olivia sat at her desk in the accounting department. From her seat, she had a perfect view of the glass conference room. She had seen the 2 slaps. She had seen Marlene drag me across the office by my collar. And she had seen the door slam so hard, the walls shook. Olivia's job involved reconciling the company's security camera retention system every month, which meant she had access to the footage archive. Her hands were trembling as she pulled up the security interface on her computer and navigated to the live feed from 30 minutes ago. She flagged the clip showing Marlene striking me twice in front of the entire office. Her cursor hovered over the report button, and she hesitated for just a moment. She remembered Marlene screaming at her last quarter over a tiny spreadsheet error that wasn't even her fault. Olivia took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and clicked the button. The message read, "Send to HR, potential incident, physical assault by manager." Back in the conference room, Marlene was still in the middle of her rant when the fire alarm suddenly blared. The sound was shrill and panicked, cutting through her voice like a knife. She cursed under her breath and marched toward the door, clearly ready to ignore it and keep going. But then she stopped cold. Through the glass, I could see 2 building security officers and a woman from HR walking straight toward our room with purpose in their steps. My chest felt like it was being squeezed by a giant hand, loosening and tightening at the same time. I wasn't sure if I was being saved or if this was about to get so much worse. Marlene spun around and glared at me, her eyes narrowing into slits. She stepped close and grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks, hissing into my ear in a voice that dripped with venom. "Don't you dare say a single word to them." Then she let go and unlocked the door, pasting a fake smile on her face. Maeve from HR stepped inside first, her expression carefully neutral and unreadable. Behind her were the 2 security officers, and to my shock, Henry, the VP of Operations. They all squeezed into the tiny conference room, and suddenly the space felt suffocating. Marlene's entire demeanor changed in an instant. Her voice became smooth and professional as she said, "We were just having a heated coaching conversation. You know how performance reviews can get emotional sometimes." She even laughed lightly, like this was all perfectly normal. My stomach flipped when Maeve's eyes landed on my face. She stared at the red mark on my cheek for a long moment, and I saw something flash in her expression. Anger, maybe, or disgust. One of the security officers shifted his weight and glanced at Henry. The silence stretched out unbearably. Finally, Maeve spoke in a calm, measured tone that somehow felt more terrifying than Marlene's shouting. "We're going to need to speak to both of you separately." They walked Marlene out of the conference room first, flanked by both security officers. I was left alone with Maeve, and my fight-or-flight instinct kicked into overdrive. My brain started spiraling with panic. What if they fire me for not finishing the project? What if they say I provoked her? What if they call this insubordination? Maeve sat down across from me and folded her hands on the table. Her voice was gentle when she asked, "Do you feel safe right now?" The question cracked something open inside me that I'd been holding shut for months. My eyes flooded with tears that I couldn't stop, and my breath came out in shaky gasps. I told her everything. The slaps, the dragging, the threats she had made in this very room just minutes ago. Maeve listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she asked quietly, "Do you have any proof of what happened in here?" My hand went to my bag. I pulled out my phone and slid it across the table. I recorded everything. Maeve pressed play on my phone, and the conference room filled with the sound of my own shaky breathing, mixed with Marlene's unfiltered cruelty. Henry stood behind Maeve with his arms folded across his chest, his jaw clenched tight as he listened. The recording played through Marlene's rant about me being lucky to have a job, and her bragging about being untouchable. When it got to the part where she said, "If I have to hurt you to make a point, I will," there was a sharp, heavy silence. I sat there with my heart pounding in my ears, waiting for them to tell me what would happen next. My hands were clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had turned white. Finally, Henry spoke, and his voice was hard as steel. "For the record, we already pulled the security camera footage from the office floor. This recording confirms everything we saw." Maeve closed her notebook and looked at me with something that almost looked like respect. "Thank you for this." They asked me to stay in the conference room while they brought Marlene back inside. This time, Maeve pulled the blinds fully open so the entire office had a clear view of what was happening. I sat on one side of the long table, and Marlene was placed on the opposite side, with a security officer standing between us. Her face was flushed, and her eyes kept darting around like she was looking for an escape route. Maeve announced in a flat, professional tone that they had reviewed security footage from the office floor and had also obtained additional evidence of the incident. Marlene tried to laugh it off. "This is all exaggerated," she said, waving her hand dismissively. She lunged at me first. I was defending myself. My stomach dropped. She was lying so easily, so confidently, as if she had done this 100 times before. Henry tapped his knuckles on the table to get her attention. Then he pressed play on my recording. Marlene's own voice filled the room, damning and undeniable. As the recording played, I watched Marlene's face change from smug confidence to rising panic. She kept interrupting, talking over her own recorded voice, insisting everything was taken out of context and that she was just under a lot of stress from Q4 deadlines. But the recording didn't lie. Her words were clear and brutal. One of the security officers handed Maeve a folder, and she opened it to reveal printed witness statements from co-workers who had seen the slaps. Diego's name was on one, Kira's was on another. Even the intern had submitted a statement. I realized in that moment that I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. People had been watching and waiting for someone to finally stand up and start the fire. Maeve read through the statements with a calm, detached expression. Then Henry closed the folder with a decisive snap and looked Marlene directly in the eyes. "This qualifies as gross misconduct and physical assault under company policy. You're done here." Henry told her she was suspended immediately, pending formal termination. For the first time since I had met Marlene, she looked small. Really, truly small. Her shoulders sagged and her hands started shaking. She begged Henry to reconsider, talking about her 10 years of service, all the sacrifices she had made for the company, how much revenue she had brought in. She even tried to drag my work performance into the conversation, saying I had always been unreliable and that I was manipulating the situation. Henry didn't budge. His expression stayed cold and unmoved. He stood up from his chair and gestured to the security officers. "We'll escort you to your desk so you can collect your personal belongings," he said in a voice that left no room for argument. Marlene looked at me one last time, and the hatred in her eyes was so intense it made my skin crawl. Then she stood up and walked toward the door, flanked by security, while the entire office watched through the glass walls. When I finally stepped out of the conference room, the entire office floor had gone completely quiet. It felt like someone had pressed a mute button on the whole world. I could feel every single pair of eyes on me, on the red mark still burning on my cheek, on my trembling hands, on the hollow, shocked expression I knew was written all over my face. I wanted to disappear. Maeve walked beside me and gently suggested we go to the on-site medical clinic so a nurse could document my injuries. She also told me I needed to file a formal incident report for legal reasons. A small, paranoid part of me worried this was where they would try to bury everything with a non-disclosure agreement and maybe a gift card to apologize. But then Maeve stopped walking and turned to look at me directly. Her voice was soft but firm when she said, "I need you to know that we are legally required to treat this as workplace violence. This isn't going away." The next hour passed in a blur. A nurse took photos of my cheek from multiple angles and asked me questions about whether I felt dizzy or nauseous. I filled out forms in triplicate, my hand cramping from writing the same information over and over. Maeve sat with me the entire time, asking careful, thorough questions about any past incidents I could remember. By the time I left the building, the sun was already setting and I felt completely numb. I went home, crawled into bed, and convinced myself that now that Marlene was suspended, the worst was finally over. That evening, my group chat with coworkers exploded with messages. Someone sent a photo of Marlene being escorted out of the building with a cardboard box in her arms. Another person shared a screenshot showing her name had been completely removed from the internal org chart. It felt like the final scene of a movie. But the next morning, I opened my email and my jaw dropped. There was a long, unhinged message from Marlene's personal email account sent to half the company, and my name was plastered all over it. In the email, Marlene called me unstable and manipulative. She claimed I had been sabotaging her projects for months and accused me of weaponizing fake victimhood to destroy her career and get ahead. She even leaked private details about my anxiety medication, something I had mentioned to her once in confidence during a vulnerable moment, and twisted it into a narrative that I was emotionally unfit to handle workplace stress. My throat closed up as I read it. Old shame that I thought I had buried years ago came flooding back, drowning me. I felt exposed and violated in a way that was almost worse than the physical slaps. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. Then another email arrived in my inbox, this one from the legal department with the subject line, "Urgent. Please come in immediately." My stomach sank. I thought they were going to tell me I was being let go after all. I grabbed my keys and drove to the office, my mind racing the entire way. In the legal conference room, I sat across from an attorney I had never met before, along with Maeve. The attorney introduced herself as Ariana and explained that Marlene's mass email had violated multiple privacy laws and company policies. They weren't just terminating her anymore. They were moving to termination with cause and pursuing legal action. She asked me if I wanted to press additional criminal charges or consider filing a civil lawsuit. I was still processing what she had said when there was a knock at the door. Olivia from accounting stepped inside, holding a folder stuffed with printed documents. She looked nervous, but determined. She explained that while reviewing records after the incident, she had discovered evidence that Marlene had been altering employee timesheets and misreporting overtime hours to make her department's budget look better. Ariana's eyes widened. She took the folder and flipped through it silently. Finally, she looked up at me and said, "You're not the first person Marlene has hurt, but you might be the last." Over the next few days, it felt like a dam had broken. Coworkers I had barely spoken to started quietly scheduling one-on-one meetings with HR. Stories poured out, years of verbal abuse, threats, and retaliation that people had been too afraid to report. It wasn't just me. Marlene had terrorized interns, intimidated senior analysts, and even screamed at vendors on the phone. Henry admitted to me privately that leadership had suspected something was wrong for a long time, but they never had enough concrete proof to take decisive action. My recording and the security footage hadn't just saved me. They had opened the door for everyone else to finally speak up. One afternoon, Henry stopped by my desk and asked if I would be willing to attend a meeting with the executive team. "We'd like your input on what happens next," he said. I agreed, even though my hands were shaking. I had never been in a room with executives before, but I wanted to make sure this actually changed something. There was a formal termination hearing conducted over a video call. Marlene dialed in from what looked like her living room, wearing a plain sweater instead of her usual sharp office clothes. She looked strangely ordinary without her power and intimidation. I was asked to officially tell my side of the story, and even though my voice shook, it didn't break. Marlene tried one last desperate tactic. She pulled out a stack of performance notes she claimed to have been keeping on me for months, painting me as unreliable and insubordinate. But the company's legal team calmly presented timestamps showing that those documents had been created on her laptop 2 full days after the incident. She had tried to fabricate evidence. The board representative, an older man with silver hair and a stern expression, leaned forward on the screen. His voice was ice cold when he said, "Your employment is terminated for cause, effective immediately. We will be contesting any unemployment claims you file, and we are moving forward with legal action based on falsified records and privacy violations." After the hearing, Ariana from legal pulled me into a separate conference room. She slid a thick document across the table toward me. It was a settlement offer. The company was willing to give me a monetary compensation package, full coverage for therapy and medical expenses related to the incident, and my job back with no retaliation. But there was one condition. I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Take the money, stay quiet, and let them handle internal reforms privately without any public scrutiny. Part of me wanted to sign immediately and never think about this place again. I was exhausted. I was emotionally drained. I just wanted it to be over. But then I thought about all the other people who had finally come forward. I thought about the next person Marlene might hurt at her next job if this stayed buried. I looked Ariana in the eye and asked, what happens to everyone else if I stay quiet? She didn't have an answer for that. I didn't sign the settlement. Instead, I wrote up my own list of conditions and handed it to Ariana the next morning. I wanted a public internal statement acknowledging what had happened. I wanted mandatory management training on harassment and retaliation for every single person in a leadership role. I wanted an anonymous third-party reporting hotline that wasn't controlled by the company's HR department. And I wanted a promotion into a new role with real authority to protect my team and make sure workloads were fair. Plus back pay for every single unpaid overtime hour I had worked in the past year. I expected them to laugh me out of the room and tell me I was being unreasonable. But Ariana just looked at me for a long moment, then glanced at Ariana, who had quietly joined the meeting. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, thinking. Finally, he said, "Give us 24 hours." I walked out of that room with my heart pounding, not sure if I had just made the best decision of my life or the worst. A day later, the company called an emergency all-hands meeting. Employees crowded into the auditorium, and those working remotely logged into the live stream. The air was buzzing with nervous energy. Henry walked onto the stage and read an official statement. He acknowledged that a manager had physically assaulted an employee. He confirmed that Marlene had been terminated for cause and that the company was pursuing legal action against her. He outlined new workplace protections, including the third-party hotline I had demanded. Then he announced the creation of a brand new role, Operations Project Lead, designed to oversee fair workloads and ensure employee safety. My heart was hammering in my chest as he paused and looked directly at me in the crowd. He said my name out loud. He announced that I was being promoted into that role, effective immediately. The room was silent for a beat. Then Diego stood up and started clapping. Kira joined him. Olivia stood up next. One by one, people got to their feet until most of the auditorium was standing and applauding. I felt tears streaming down my face, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of fear or shame. They were relief. Just when I finally started to breathe again and settle into my new role, security called my desk one afternoon. Someone downstairs was demanding to see me. The moment they said her name, my stomach dropped. Marlene. I went down expecting a confrontation, but I still wasn't prepared for what I saw. She looked wrecked. Her hair was messy, her clothes wrinkled, her face twisted with bitterness and rage. The second she spotted me, she lunged forward, but security stepped between us. She started screaming that I had ruined her life, that I had taken everything from her. She blamed me for being jobless, broke, humiliated, abandoned by everyone she thought cared about her. She spat out every ugly thought she had been holding on to, insisting I had destroyed 10 years of her career in one afternoon. For a moment, that old fear tried to creep up my spine, because her voice was the same voice that used to control entire rooms. But it didn't sink into me the way it used to. I didn't shrink. When she paused to catch her breath, I told her the truth as calmly as I could. You didn't lose your life because of me. You lost it the second you decided to put your hands on me. She stared at me like I had just stabbed her. Then she started shouting again, saying she would never forgive me, that I would regret this someday. Security escorted her out as she kept yelling my name, blaming me for every crack in the life she had destroyed herself. When the doors closed behind her, something inside me finally settled. Not happiness, not triumph, just peace. Her final meltdown didn't scare me anymore. It confirmed something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. She wasn't haunting my life. She was clinging to the ashes of hers. And I walked back upstairs knowing this was the real ending, not her fall. My freedom.